Hi, and welcome to this session on coping with change. Now, today's session is a recorded session, but you can also join us for a live Q&A on September the 24th. And you can find the details for that on the Emotional Health CBT Clinic Facebook page. So I have entitled this session today From Coping to Embracing Change. And what I'd like to cover for you today are not only some basic coping or adaptation strategies, but hopefully also a few ideas to inspire you to embrace change or to take a very different view of change and what it can add to your life. I'll introduce myself. I'm Francine McInnes. I'm a clinical and organizational psychologist, and I'm one of the staff members at the Emotional Health CBT Clinic. Now, maybe I'll say just a few words about the current change context and what inspired this session today, though probably doesn't require a lot of explanation given that we're all bathing in a fair bit of change most of the time these days, but maybe a few things that make these characteristics unique. So we're all going through some amount of change a lot of the time, some of which is chosen change, but recently there's been a lot of externally imposed changes, and particularly changes that would be registered for people as threats to our core human motivations. And by that, I mean our core motivations for autonomy, for feeling competent, and feeling connected. And so that probably resonates for you, given the pandemic, how a lot of those things have been compromised all at once by many things that we didn't choose. Another unique characteristic is how what we're living right now affects so many spheres at once. So there are implications for our health. There may be implications for our financial picture. There are probably significant changes for our family structure and organization. Same thing for our work, and also for our social or personal connections. Over and above that, are what I would describe as rolling changes. So sometimes we initiate a change, or a change is initiated for us, like we change jobs or we change homes or cities. And then we start adapting to that, and progressively over time, we start to feel more and more comfortable, connected, and able to handle those changes. But recently, what you might have tapped into is that those changes continue to change. So as we reach a different level of awareness or competence or stage of the pandemic, new changes are often introduced to continue to adapt as on a broader scale to what we're facing. So it puts us in some ways back at the beginning of our change coping strategies. Another characteristic is that it's a very undefined and now prolonged period of change. So sometimes changes are often they can be undefined or uncertain, but sometimes we undertake some changes and we know it's going to be for a certain period of time. And part of what has been a bit of a change strain for people is not knowing how long we're going to be in each of the different phases, and whether or not we continue to move forward or sometimes have to back up and cover familiar ground before anxiously awaiting going forward again. And I think what I'd particularly emphasize about current circumstances is that because we've hit all of our spheres at once for many of us, a lot of our normal regulators, a lot of the things that help us to regain equilibrium when we're facing change, have been either not available or more difficult to access as ways to counterbalance our coping strategies. So those would include exercise, or how we create boundaries between our work and our personal life, our social connections. These are all things that normally help us to adapt to the changes that are in our lives, but have been disrupted in and of themselves, which compromises or makes it more complex re-establishing that equilibrium. And the last point I would say, which is in some ways advantageous, but in other ways disadvantageous, is the famous saying about, well, we're not all in the same boat, but we're all in the same storm, meaning we're all affected by the pandemic to varying degrees. And this is helpful in the sense that you don't need to explain really to anybody what you're going through on some level, because we are all facing some level of compromise or perceptions of threat, but not in the same way. So in some ways that means there's an inherent support and understanding and sense of community, but in other ways we're not quite affected in the same ways. And so some people who feel like they've reestablished equilibrium might not understand the complexities of your situation. And so it can be both an advantage and a disadvantage to be in that same storm all at the same time. And it means that some of the people who normally support us are facing their own challenges, so might be less available. So what are the impacts of the changes that we're going through? You've probably heard of some of the more common, or experienced the more common reactions that we're hearing about. And some will even liken that to the grief response, given that so much has changed, and for many feel like things have been unexpectedly or unfairly taken away. So you might identify with that initial feeling of shock, feelings of loss for things that have changed or been removed, frustration at not being able to access things that normally bring us facility or pleasure, sadness at very particular things that may have happened in our lives that really touch us deeply. And I'd like to highlight that sometimes those emotional impacts can be positive around recognizing some things that are important to us, feeling supported and feeling that sense of connection and community, feeling intrigued and curious when we're learning and adapting. But there's a whole host of emotional impacts that we can expect when we're going through this volume of change. Another more surprising area of impact for many are the cognitive impacts. So even though we're all going through similar things, and we've been through changes before, our cognitive systems are really affected by change in and of itself, but particularly by the volume of changes. So you might notice impacts on your attention and memory, your ability to concentrate. And one big contributor to this is that so many of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis that we're quite competent, quite effective at handling because it's familiar, means that those actions and those routines, they've all shifted oftentimes into autopilot, into automation. And when we change so many things at once, it brings them back into conscious awareness and needing of conscious decisions and conscious choices and attention. And so this really taxes our cognitive systems. And so we feel the impacts, these secondary effects of having difficulty recalling and paying attention and concentrating. We also have significant impacts on body regulation. So you might have noticed, depending on the person, you'll notice some more than others, or you'll feel more affected in some zones than others. But body regulation is a quite normal area to see effects in. So you might notice that your energy level is affected. You might notice sleep dysregulation, where you feel like sleeping more or you're able to sleep less than you normally would. And also same thing for appetite, feeling more of an appetite or less of an appetite than usual. And finally, we see effects on our behavior. That could be an increase in consumption of certain things, whether or not that's food or alcohol or purchasing or shows, this kind of thing, where we're actively trying to cope, maybe not consciously, but actively in a behavioral way, trying to cope, by these different actions that we take to try and calm the system or distract the system from these stressors. So it has this behavioral form, but it could also be shutting down and withdrawing. So rather than active, like an absence of actions, because the system feels taxed or overwhelmed by the volume of change. Or reactivity, acting out, quickly making one decision and then making another, sometimes contradictory decision. All responses or attempts, consciously or unconsciously, to regulate ourselves in the face of this volume of change. And just a quick note that all of these impacts, whether they're emotional, cognitive, body changes, or behavioral, they're going to be present whether these are self-imposed, even positive changes, or externally imposed, things that we don't consider very positive changes. The system nonetheless is going to react when we've changed a lot at once. So these are just normal responses that the body and mind will have in a context of change. So how are people coping with all of this change? And I would invite you to take a moment and think about how you've been coping with the changes that you've been facing. And I think people move and continue to move through different phases, partly because of the characteristics I mentioned earlier around the nature of the changes that we're facing. And I would say at the beginning, my observation was that early days, there was maybe even an absence of active coping. So a lot of people felt we were just really in pause mode. So because all of this is so unfamiliar, not knowing like how long does each phase last and how am I meant to cope, maybe everything will go back, sounding like the familiar grief stages of trying to renegotiate the reality and kind of hope we can all just go back to the way things were. So in the early days, my observation was we did a lot less active coping. There was a lot more pause in our natural ways that we try to reestablish equilibrium. And as time grew on, there was more efforts to respond to the changes that were in place. And I think now later, at a later period in our adaptation, I think people are much more actively thinking about, because they've really noticed all the effects and all of the disruption that the changes have created, and are looking to take a much more active, thoughtful approach to how they're going to respond to where we are now. And that's, I would say, is also a distinguishing characteristic for people who are coping relatively well with all this change, is that they see the effects, they feel the effects, and they want to get on top of it and make some thoughtful, active choices to set their life on a new course in a way that sets them up for feeling better and making good choices in this context. So what are some strategies for coping or adapting more effectively to change? So you'll notice some connections back to the points earlier that I made, but one really core strategy to think about is how can you restore some of those things that have been dysregulated by the changes. And one of the basic or core ways that you can put yourself in a good state for coping with change is to try and reestablish basic or core body regulation. Look at your sleeping habits, your eating habits, your schedule, things that help put the body in a healthier, more regular rhythm. And some of that fell off of the rails because our normal structures and routines were off. And so our sleep habits and our eating habits also went off the rails. So we can think about, can we look at our schedule again and reestablish healthy starts to the day and ends to the day in terms of the hours that we keep? Can we think about how we schedule things in that used to be scheduled and that schedule got thrown off, and how we can reestablish the schedule? or if we notice changes in our eating. And I think we all know personally what are good eating habits and which ones really don't have us feeling good. And can we start to move some of those healthy foods back in and some of the ones that make us feel not as good back out, now that we know that this is our reality for a while. So we're not in a pause situation. We need to kind of get into a more regular rhythm. Another area is the boundaries between work and personal time. And we had a lot of those boundaries without necessarily being consciously aware of them. So one example that I hear a lot from clients, whether that's in the work context or in the one-on-one work that I do with people, is how many little things we did to create lines between our personal life and our work life. And a simple example are the morning routines, including, our commute. So some folks, they had a way of starting their day, maybe in the home context, perhaps with family, and there are certain things that they do, and then you put on your coat and you walk to work or you take the metro to work, and there's this transition that is built in from what we consider our personal time, our personal life, into our work life. And so there's all of these cues that show us, okay, now we're shifting gears. And this helps us to put us and change states and change areas of focus. And a lot of those things were lost because people get up and eat and sleep and spend time with their family and play all in the same space. So that's one of the things you can take a look at, is how can I recreate boundaries between these different activities that helps me to change gears and sets me the cues to do one thing after another, so everything is not happening on a conscious level, which taxes our resources. So for example, some people have finally set up a designated space for work so that they close that door when the workday is finished, so that signals end of work time. And so that not only creates a clear transition, but it also helps create some boundaries in terms of the number of hours that can create excessive stress and dysregulate sleep, and create a lot of blurriness that is hard on the system. So these boundaries are demarcations of how you start your day, move into work, move out of work, move into family time, are things that help us to have a sense of equilibrium and easier cues without thinking all the time. Or you can think about how you start your day and what you want to start your day with, that signals to yourself how you want this day to start. Is that with a walk? Is that with a little meditation? Is that with a cup of tea? All signaling a gradual, thoughtful, a way to start the day that feels within your control, even if that's only for a few minutes before you shift into working time. So just think about how you set up these boundaries and can reestablish them on new terms now that you're in different circumstances. Another suggestion is around how you regulate the nervous system. So when we are in a lot of change, whether or not that's positive and self-chosen change, or whether or not that's externally imposed, it does create stresses on the body, which our nervous system is tackling. And so we can sometimes feel, more rapid breathing. We can feel changes in heart rate and heating. We can just sense that the nervous system is aroused. And one thing that we can do is trying to help that nervous system ground or calm back down, so that we feel in a calm, grounded state to face the different parts of our day. And so things like short breathing exercises, doing a little bit of yoga or meditation, even spending time in nature has been shown to have a really positive effect on the nervous system. So you can think about what signals you've noticed that your nervous system is reacting strongly, and which kinds of strategies are useful to you, because everybody has ones they prefer more than others that might help ground or calm the nervous system. And then I put down also rebuilding structures and routines. It ties a little bit with boundaries, but one of the things that we had, I mentioned earlier, that helps us is our routine and concrete signals that help us move from one thing to another. So, one of the things you can think about is how you set up your workspace and how you schedule your day to reestablish that routine. Where does exercise fit in? Where does your breathing techniques fit in? Where does devoted time with members of your family or your friends or neighbors fit into this overall structure of what goes into your days? To do so in a really thoughtful way, like what do I want to and need to include in my day, and how can it fit? And how can I set that up so that the cues are simple and clear for me to follow and take more and more out of the conscious processing and deciding and more sliding into healthy routines. And the last one is around really tapping into some of the thought patterns that we all have our maladaptive or unhealthy thinking patterns at different times, but when we're in a prolonged period, what can be a prolonged period of stress, sometimes those thought patterns are even more prevalent than ever. So making a concerted effort to tap into what thinking patterns we may have engaged, whether or not we can be prone to catastrophizing or getting into black and white thinking or overgeneralization. And you can find examples of thinking patterns for free. You can just type that into a Google search and look at the examples and see if you can identify which ones that are recurring unhelpful or unhealthy thought patterns, and then start to actively challenge and restructure those in a way that's more helpful, because oftentimes there are these little insidious demons of thoughts in there that are discouraging or derailing or preventing us from more healthy ways that can facilitate or else derail our active coping strategies. Now, maybe just to shift gears for a moment to talk about moving from coping with change to embracing change. So sometimes when we're in a change pattern, we can get into this process of at first just trying to survive it, like everything's a bit frozen or paused at best. And then we can shift into coping, where we understand that we're affected by the changes and we see the effects, and we're actively coping to reset a healthier way to respond to the changes. And even further down the continuum, if you want to think about it on a continuum from not coping to more effectively coping to maybe even actively latching on to the changes and even embracing the change as something that can be quite positive for people. And so examples of what distinguishes that way of responding to change is really seeing the benefits, whether you've chosen the change or not. What are the positives that these change circumstances could be bringing to your life depending on how you react to them? So for example, a lot of people have been brought to reevaluate what's most important to them. What are my priorities? What are my values? What really at its core are my strongest motivators? And how can I engage those right now during this period of change? If I like to be autonomous is really important, then this space where there can be a lot of flexibility and autonomy, how can I set myself up in this period to really maximally feel the advantages of that and even maximize that for me, which would be a benefit? Or if I really competence, building skills is really important to me. How can I leverage the opportunity of right now to build some skill sets that I've been wanting to build, whether or not that's how you embrace technology or how you weave exercise into your daily life or learning to meditate? What are some of these learning areas or skill areas that you can really focus on developing now that there's an opportunity, even if that initially started as an imposed opportunity, I'm going to jump on this opportunity to build some skills. Or if I look at my values and I have been led by the circumstances to question my values, now that I feel I've revised them or I'm more aware of the priorities, how aligned do I feel with those values? And how can I implement small changes to feel more aligned? And I put this in the embracing or thriving end of the continuum, because people who live in ways that are aligned with values, they tend to thrive emotionally from that sense of alignment, sense of meaning, sense of personal satisfaction of living according to one's values. And how do I really embrace this state or this stage that I'm in, and really focus on living right now, which is both helpful and not, we talked about thinking patterns and catastrophizing and getting ahead of things in a way that causes stress. How can I not only curb or let go of that thinking pattern and come back to what's going on right now? What are the advantages or the benefits of this current stage or my current state, and how can I be more fully in the present so that I can live the benefits and learn or grow maximally from really drinking all of the opportunities in. And one particularly effective mindset or model that I've come across is called growth mindset, and you can learn more about this by doing some searches on YouTube. It's a model that was developed by Carol Dweck, and it really talks about how some folks, maybe some come by it more naturally, but it can be cultivated in everyone. When they face a challenge or a difficult situation, this is something that they move towards. This is something that they find interesting, that they find growth promoting. And so they are not shut down or overwhelmed. They are intrigued. They pursue or they move towards things that feel difficult or challenging or harder, or that surpass the skills that they currently have. And so going in or noticing situations that feel bigger than us or harder than things that we faced before can evoke that response, or we can cultivate that response in the face of things that are challenging, so that not only do we face this situation and these circumstances more effectively, but it becomes a more natural response of our own to all kinds of different challenging situations. And so we feel less shut down and overwhelmed when facing challenge. And a couple more ideas around that embracing or thriving response. There's a book called Infinite Games. And in this book, they talk about this idea of worthy rivals, that there are people that we really notice out there who we consider are worthy rivals, people that we admire, people that we think do things particularly well in a certain realm. And sometimes we can have a response of viewing them as rivals or people that we can compete with. But we can also see them as people who inspire us, that we can observe, that we can look at and see, what is it that they do that makes them so effective, that makes that I see as a source of inspiration for something I would like to be stronger at or demonstrate more effectively? And what can I find out about how they go about that through my own observation, through reading what it is that they do, so that I have examples of the way that I'd like to respond, or a skill set that I'd like to have that I can work towards. And then finally, who and what are your growth resources? If you're taking this opportunity to grow your skills or grow the ways that you respond to challenge, what are the concrete resources, tools, learning opportunities, and people who can be there to encourage you, to teach you or coach you or mentor you through this change, who are either great supporters, great in terms of morale and emotional support, or great supporters in terms of having skills that you might not have who could show you the way or contribute to your learning. So this is how you move from that middle ground of coping and responding more in a more healthy and effective way, all the way up to actually seeing change and seeing this challenging context as an opportunity to grow and to thrive and to make your life even better in some ways than it was before. So this is a lot of different ideas to think about. And so a common question is, well, whoa, given all of that, where should I start? And if you think about it, it's kind of an idea more than anything else, a construct. Think about it on a continuum. If you feel like you're just barely coping day to day, you might want to start with the basics of setting up a workstation, of setting up a schedule, of looking at basic body regulators like your sleep schedule and your eating habits and a little bit of exercise. So some of the core things that get us into a basic structure and state that puts us in good shape for coping and taking on the other challenges. So I would start with the coping and adaptation strategies. And then once you feel like you've got a little bit of a rhythm and you're responding in a more healthy, effective way to the changes that you have in your life, then you might want to think in moving into the embracing and the starting to shift your mindset and your approach to change in a way that brings opportunities and new skills to your life. So I would start with fundamentals and then layer in some of the big embracing ideas later. That said, some people are more kind of long range, big picture thinkers, and they might enjoy stepping back and getting the big picture view. And I would suggest lots of people would benefit from taking that step back look and then coming in and saying, well, where do I have the most appetite, energy, interest, readiness to change? And I would, I'll give you a few more tips at the end, and I would, choose mindfully one or two small things to change in order to also not take on too much all at once. So a lot of the things that I'm talking about involves changing our habits. And one of the things that threw us off with all the changes that we are responding to is a lot of these things that we do in our day-to-day life that helps us to cope effectively are our habits, our daily habits. And so a lot of them got uprooted or upended or changed or became inaccessible. And so we're now, if we're going to put these kinds of things back into place, we're talking about establishing new habits. And so I've put up here a couple of books that if you like to learn about the change discipline, creating sustainable and healthy habits. These are a couple of books that I found really quite helpful because the bottom one by Charles Duhigg explains the science of how habits are formed, because often people get really hard on themselves. They get on their own case about habits. When if you observe them like through a scientist's mind, you can see how that habit got set up and maybe why it got set up, not only in a way so that you don't just get into kind of a self-critical or other blaming mindset, but look at it to see what are the pieces or the elements that contribute to this forming and sustaining this habit, which also tells you if I were to undo or modify this habit to be healthier, what are the points along that chain that I can act upon to create a new and healthier habit? And that book describes in some detail what are those components? How do habits get formed and how can we change them? And then James Clear's book on atomic habits is this great amalgamation of all kinds of research and expertise on how you make those changes, how you create new disciplines and habits, you leveraging all that great information out there, because there's a whole field, a whole discipline on forming and breaking and implementing new habits. So if you're into that big picture, if you're curious about the big picture thriving approach, one thing you can think about is how you can bring yourself through that exercise of realigning your values But I will say many people might have difficulty naming what those values are. And I would have to think about it for a minute if you asked me mine, but I would enjoy the exercise because it's kind of it can be a little bit unnerving if you suspect a values misalignment, but it can be so fruitful also to walk yourself through a values exercise of naming what are my top values, and then doing the exercise of how aligned I am or how I could improve that alignment to feel more satisfied. Because a lot of folks, for example, would name as a benefit of the changes the time that they spend with family. While it's definitely intense at times being confined with your family, a lot of people have said they've really enjoyed some aspects of having this much time with family and realized to a greater extent how important family was to them. So just an example of when you're taking that big picture approach, you probably need to build the framework for what is that big picture for you. And then you're working within a framework that you have set. Or you can also just go from an observational approach of saying, what do I keep bumping into that's frustrating me, that I'm struggling with, that can cause you to shut down or to kind of get into an emotional spin of just wishing things were different or just being angry or frustrated. Or I can say, I'm take an observer standpoint, a step back standpoint, say, what do I keep bumping into that are skills that are difficult for me? Is that about setting boundaries? Is that about how I make healthy choices for food, exercise, sleep? Is it technology? Am I struggling with technology, or am I struggling with connecting with people at a distance? What are the skill sets that I'm noticing I need to strengthen? And then you can think about, okay, well, which of those do I want to focus on acquiring to not only be more effective and struggle less, but also start to see the opportunities to grow. And a last idea around the thriving approach is a lot of people in this period of change are thinking about how is this period, which is different from our usual lives, is kind of has this unique bubble period. How is it an opportunity? How can I see it as an opportunity to invest in the future? So, if it's concerted family time, how do I want to leverage this time to reinvest in family and family connections and the importance of family and how we spend time together and support one another, that's going to serve us all for the long term? And how do I maximally use this time so that it does serve that purpose? And if it's work, what are the skill sets that I can learn now? Or if you're a business, you have your own business, where can I invest right now so that as things start to open up and return to whatever our new version of normal is going to be, what do I want to put in place now that's going to have that long-term benefit? So I can see this as a period of investment in myself and my business or my professional skills that is advantageous to me. Same thing with investment. How do I want to manage my money differently? Or how do I want to look at my health differently? How do I want to start new habits or improve or shift, even our physical fitness in a way that's going to be serving us for the longer term? I mean, we've learned so much around what contributes to health that we might want to hang on to. So what can we do now for the long run? And here's a few resources I can suggest when it's more in that embracing change. I've put here Carol Dweck's book on mindset because it's one of the most, I find, transformational books that I read that really shifts your entire view of how you face challenges and things that are difficult in a way that feels interesting, engaging, growth promoting. And absolutely, this is something that some people come by more naturally, but the whole book talks about how you can cultivate that. And if you're not really into the book, you can just look up Carol Dweck videos on YouTube on growth mindset. And she's a wonderful speaker. You can learn a little bit about it there too and see if you want to delve in further. There's also a site you can go online and do a free assessment of your character strengths. So that can also give you some good grounding around how can I leverage my top strengths? You know, what are my top strengths, and people who are using them, who have opportunities, who have created opportunities to use them on a daily basis, do much better emotionally. And it's a really fun way to surface or to highlight what are some of those strengths, which feels good in of itself. And then to think creatively around what are my opportunities, or which ones could I create to be able to use those more effectively and more often. That's going to change the shape and the feel of my days and what I focus on. And the last square, the bullseye, is an example from a therapy called Action Commitment Therapy, ACT it's called. And there are lots of free exercises online to do values assessments, where it helps you to reflect on your values and where you are aligned or less aligned with your values, so that it can stimulate a thoughtful, fruitful reflection on what steps, what areas are least aligned and most aligned, and what you might like to do to get those better aligned. And maybe just one last thought or set of tips is around being cognizant of the fact that changes never happen. Our changes, our thoughtful, adaptive responses, they don't happen overnight. It's really a process of identifying, making shifts, and seeing how that plays out, and then making some adjustments and continuing to go. So there's, people often are quite hard on themselves around implementing new things and why they aren't getting it or why it isn't working. But it's quite an involved process up front to get them set up. And then once it becomes well ingrained, it serves us tremendously. But the process itself is quite an investment. So to be both thoughtful around what choices you make to implement, and compassionate in that process as you go through the trial and error or the experimentation phase, make adjustments so that it can serve you over the long run. And I put up this model. You don't need to know all the details of it, but just as a way to illustrate how people go through these different stages of readiness to make changes in their lives. And I would highlight in particular the pre-contemplation phase, where people are often not even aware that some of the things that they're doing are unhealthy. And they're not convinced of what people are telling them they should do. And so when you find yourself, thinking I should do this or I should do that, sometimes we're not even convinced that the change is important to us or meaningful, or that it would be useful to us. So sometimes we're at a very early stage of even reflecting on what changes we want to make. So certainly not ready to get right into the active or action phase of starting to make changes in our lives, because we're really kind of earlier on in that reflection phase. So really think about, if you're in that, I'm not even sure I want to do this, I wouldn't focus a lot of energy and attention on making changes in that zone. Whereas when you're contemplating, you're like pretty convinced, or you think it's important, but you're still gathering information, building your awareness around how this is affecting you and whether or not this is important. And so you might be more in a things that stimulate your reflection, things that feed you information. And you're moving into this preparation phase of what's important, what do I need to do, what are sources of information, what are resources, whether those are material resources or people supports that I can put into place, before moving into actions where you're experimenting and trying things and seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, which is very experimental or trial and error based, rather than a very fluid process. And then you're into this maintenance and relapse prevention. So I'd really invite you to think about where you are if you're thinking about making a change in this readiness cycle, and how you can help move yourself from one phase to another to have more better odds of success in what you do implement. And so Along those lines, here's a few last tips before I close out for today, is to be honest with yourself, not hard on yourself, honest with yourself about when you think about the changes that you might like to implement that would help you to either go from kind of survival mode to more effective coping, or from coping to thriving. Where are you in that process most ready to start to take an active phase or an active approach, and how can you help yourself along in that process? And then, you'll get more effective results for the efforts that you make. So, I would encourage you to express yourself, not only because talking about it helps you to identify what you're feeling, why you might be feeling that, what's important to you, but as you do that, it gives people an opportunity to support you, and also helps start to stimulate some ideas about what people have tried and what they have found successful. And so in that expression phase with others, you're getting lots of benefits, from breaking the tension of carrying stressful things to also getting input and support from people. So expression in of itself is helpful. So really tap into your social circle, not only to validate or normalize some of the things you're going through, but to really pull in your supports, moral support or practical support, or mentors or coaches who are available to you as a really important resource, even if it's at a distance. And also think broadly about resources. So much of what we learn these days, there's so much content available, books, videos, people, training guides that we can pull in once we've decided. Again, once we're really down the path and in active mode, there's tons of resources available. And also don't hesitate to pull in professionals if you have those kind of resources, maybe through, your benefits at work, or maybe you can afford to spend a little bit of your funds to get like a financial opinion or a legal opinion, or invest in some tools or software to help things go more smoothly. Or who can you consult with to make some good choices for yourself that might, when you feel like the solutions or the ideas are beyond what you can come up with by yourself. So engage some professionals if that can also be helpful. So I'm going to leave you with those ideas for now, and I'm going to invite you once again to join us on September the 24th in the evening for a Q&A. And I will look forward to seeing you then. Take care. Bye-bye.